Father Peter Cameron, in one of his editorials in the Missalette, the Magnificat, writes about the way we look at the trying circumstances in our lives. He says one of our big temptations in life is to think that our bad circumstances are against us. We presume that the reason we're not happy is because we have been saddled with circumstances that make our happiness impossible. Circumstances that make us feel as if life is conspiring against us. But then I wonder, how is it that someone like St. Paul can say, I'm content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and constraints for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I think St. Paul is content with hardships because he recognizes that the trying circumstances in his life are not obstacles in his path. Instead, he realizes they are the very way that God calls us to himself. The 18th century spiritual master, Father Jean-Paul de Caussade, a Jesuit, tells us, the life of faith is the untiring pursuit of God through all that disguises and disfigures him and, as it were, destroys and annihilates him. You are seeking for secret ways of belonging to God, but there is only one, making use of whatever he offers you. Everything leads you to this union with him. What he's saying, and what St. Paul understands, is that our lives are not just things to put up with. We fool ourselves if we think that peace and contentment will come if we can just figure out how to improve our circumstances once and for all. The trying circumstances in our lives can be awakenings that challenge and educate us. And the way that we choose to deal with them reveals to us and to others just who Jesus Christ is for us. Believe it or not, our troubles actually call us back to God's presence. For only God's presence makes the circumstances that we fear and struggle with change. And knowing the trust that God is completely and utterly for us can keep us going. St. Paul startles us again when he says in one of his letters that we are saved by hope because the basis for our hope is the loving power of God. Why? Again, because we depend upon God and not just on ourselves. With the aid of his grace, we can do all things. And grace is never lacking to a person of goodwill. In the midst of our difficulties and temptations, it's consoling to know that when our will joins with the grace of God, it forms a combination that cannot be overcome. It has been said that God's grace united to a person's goodwill constitutes a majority in any situation. So when we entrust the circumstances of our lives, those difficulties, those struggles, to God's grace, we find that we are wonderfully liberated from ourselves. We float on the waves of God's providence like a cork on the ocean. We grow in hope by first learning to see God in all things, and then later to see all things in God, which is and who is both the center of our lives and the circumference that surrounds us, the beginning and the end. St. Teresa of Avila advises us when she says, "Contemplate God and be at peace." At the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., there's this beautiful bronze statue of the Holy Family, and it's entitled "The Flight into Egypt." The artist had captured the Holy Family at a moment of rest in the middle of the desert, and they're utterly exhausted from this long journey, from the threat of death which is behind them, from which they have escaped, and from the anticipation of reaching their destination, and also the harsh desert surroundings. Now, the donkey looks as if it is literally collapsed on the spot and has become a temporary stump for the weary mother and her child to sit upon. And Joseph is sitting on the ground, and he's leaning against Mary's legs, resting his head on his knees while holding his staff with both hands. Mary and the child Jesus look parched with thirst, and their faces have a shimmer to them that allows you to virtually sense the sweat on their skin and the fatigue in their bones. But what's so amazing about this statue is that one does not sense an ounce of despair or helplessness in them. All of them have this radiating hope. All the faces, including that of the donkey, have a look of serenity about them. But the most compelling characteristic about the sculpture is Mary's face. She's holding her face up to the sun, and there is both a consent and a surrender in her expression. And it's the consent of faith, that faithful embrace of the present moment that says, "Do with me whatever you will," followed by a hope which trusts that no matter what, all will be well. It's obvious why this bronze statue of the flight into Egypt is the most popular statue in the entire shrine, because Mary's feet have been rubbed clean by the hands of thousands in need who have touched them, perhaps longing for the same hope. The virtue of hope, which stands midway between presumption and despair, is the gift that we seek and ask of Mary. To quote from the song Requiem, written in a time of disaster and trial, "O Mother Mary, find us where we've fallen out of grace. Lead us to a higher place. In the dark night of the soul, our broken hearts you can make whole. O Mother Mary, come and carry us in your embrace. Let us see your gentle face, Mary."